On this Thursday night, relief and a reprieve from Russia's war in Ukraine. Hundreds of Ukrainians make it to safety in Zaporizhia, while some Russians hide after criticizing the Kremlin.
We have very big troubles right now with the freedom.
Plus, new blasts at that bombed-out steel plant. Quebec scraps most of its mask mandates, how politics could be at play, while the U.S. marks a brutal benchmark in the pandemic. And a long, difficult journey.
I hope nobody else of color has to go through this.
An Indigenous man wrongfully arrested at a Vancouver bank on the importance of forgiveness.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin again tonight in Ukraine. Heavy fighting is still going on in Mariupol. Russian troops are trying to destroy the last pocket of resistance at that huge steel plant. That would give Russian President Vladimir Putin his first significant success before Victory Day on May 9th in Russia, when that country marks the surrender of Nazi Germany and the end of World War II. It's hard to know exactly what's happening at the steel plant. Russia controls access. It's believed hundreds of soldiers and civilians are trapped beneath it, where they've been sheltering for weeks. As well, more than $8 billion has been raised at an international donors conference in Warsaw to help Ukraine, though the country's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is begging the world for more. And there are diplomatic disagreements about how U.S. intelligence is being used to target Russian generals on the battlefield. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
Another evacuation convoy from Mariupol rolls its way into Zaporizhia. The Red Cross says more than 300 people escaped the besieged city, but it's thought 100,000 are still left behind. New footage from Ukraine's Azov battalion shows large explosions on the site of the Azovstal steelworks, where soldiers and an estimated 200 civilians are sheltering underground. The battalion's deputy commander again blaming Russia for the standoff, saying enemy forces are at the site. Russian troops have encircled the complex for weeks, but the Kremlin insists they have not pushed any further than its boundaries, just as other borders undergo symbolic change. At Mariupol's city limits, workers replace Ukrainian language road signs with Russian ones. Elsewhere in the Donbass region, more destruction. In the past day, local authorities saying 5 civilians were killed and 25 injured in bombings. Russia going a step further, claiming it killed 600 Ukrainian troops overnight. But Russia is taking heavy losses too. Ukraine claims it has killed up to 12 Russian generals. A New York Times story says U.S. intelligence has helped make that happen.
Ukraine needs over 12,000 tons of humanitarian aid every day.
In Warsaw, Poland's Prime Minister co-chaired an international donor conference to support Ukraine, raising more than $8 billion. And now President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he also needs you.
Here, in one click, you can donate funds to protect our defenders, to save our civilians, and to rebuild Ukraine.
Ukraine launching a website for individual donors to contribute military, humanitarian and reconstruction aid. Well, he might. Some estimates say it will cost $500 billion to rebuild Ukraine after the war. When that will be, no one knows. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Israel's prime minister says the Russian president has apologized to him after Russia's foreign minister said Nazi leader Adolf Hitler had Jewish origins. After a phone call with Putin, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said he accepted Putin's rare apology and said he thanked him. Sergei Lavrov was asked on Italian TV why Russia claims it's denazifying Ukraine when President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is himself Jewish. Lavrov said that Hitler also had Jewish blood. One of Russia's richest men claims he has gone into hiding, hired bodyguards, and lost billions of dollars, all because he posted a message on social media criticizing the war in Ukraine. Oleg Tinkov is one of the only members of Russia's elite to openly condemn the Russian invasion. But as Jeff Semple reports, he certainly isn't the only one being targeted.
Anti-war protests in Russia over the past 2 months typically haven't lasted long. 15,000 people have been arrested under a new law passed in early March criminalizing public opposition to the war in Ukraine. Russians aren't even allowed to call it a war. Instead, it's a special military operation.
It's just an insane situation right now.
This Russian high school teacher says within days of the invasion, school staff received a crash course on a new curriculum, told to teach their students the Kremlin's preferred version of events.
About the fake news in Ukraine, about the so-called Nazis in the east side of Ukrainian territory.
In response, Cameron Manafly posted this message on Instagram, expressing concerns and saying, "I do not want to be a mirror of state propaganda." When he refused his principal's request to remove the post, he says he was fired and dragged out of the school by security. After that, he fled the country.
Getting worse day by day. We have very big troubles right now with the freedom.
And that crackdown on freedoms extends all the way up to the elite. Russian business tycoon Oleg Tinkov told the New York Times the Kremlin forced him to sell his stake in one of Russia's biggest banks, which he founded, after this Instagram post in which he condemned Putin's crazy war, adding that innocent people and soldiers are dying.
I really applaud to him.
This former Russian deputy finance minister, now in exile, says many Russian business people are afraid to speak out, but fiercely oppose the war.
It's a destruction of the economy. Economy is demolishing, and they say that, okay, we are going down and we don't know where's the end, where's the bottom.
This Canadian was recently added to a fast-growing list of foreign journalists and politicians banned from visiting Russia for criticizing the Kremlin.
Things are not going as planned for Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. So that domestic repression, that repression of any sort of criticism, has only intensified over the past 2 months. And I suspect that it will only get worse.
The worse the war goes for Russia, he says, the more desperate and dangerous its president will become. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
The World Health Organization has a new estimate of how many people have died from COVID-19. The WHO believes nearly 15 million people have died in the last 2 years from causes related to the virus. That's almost 3 times as many deaths as officially have been reported. Per capita, one of the hardest hit countries is the United States, where it's now believed nearly 1 million Americans have died of COVID-19. As Jackson Proskow reports, that stunning toll has not eased the deep divisions over vaccines and precautions in the U.S.
American tragedy is etched into the monuments of Washington, D.C. The 58,000 soldiers killed in Vietnam, the 418,000 who never returned from the Second World War. Yet the greatest loss of American life in a generation has gone largely unacknowledged, the 1 million who've died from COVID-19.
The person who would comfort you when you suffer a humongous loss like this is the person who's gone.
COVID took what mattered most to Arianne Bennet, Scott, her husband of 30 years. They were partners in life and in their restaurant business.
Scott's empty spot is in bed next to me every night and every morning. It's in my heart next to me. It's in my business. Every day when we would make choices.
Despite being cautious and fully vaccinated, Scott contracted COVID in December. He died after nearly a month in hospital.
You don't want to be my husband in a hospital room saying to me on FaceTime, I wish I'd worn my mask. I promise when I get out, I'm going to wear my mask all the time.
In the U.S., huge numbers of people remain unmoved by those risks. They have scoffed at precautions and refused vaccines at some of the highest rates in the world.
The anti-vaccine groups are so emboldened right now.
Vaccine scientist Dr. Peter Hotez has run out of words to describe this uniquely American failure.
200,000 unvaccinated Americans since May 1 last year have lost their lives because they refused to get vaccinated, because they were defiant of getting vaccinated. I don't even know what you call that anymore.
When it comes to understanding how it all happened, Dr. Rick Bright knows better than most.
We never anticipated political interference in an outbreak.
As a former government scientist, he blew the whistle on the early pandemic response of the Trump administration as too political and underprepared.
Imagine when you have the best vaccines and the best drugs and the best diagnostics on the planet, that you would have political leadership that would discourage their use, that would politicize science.
Today, Dr. Bright believes many Americans have simply come to accept mass death as a way of life.
People are really tired. People are confused. People are still getting mixed messages about the importance of some of those life-saving measures.
Mandates have got to go!
For all those vocally opposed to vaccination and those who are simply over it, there is an unmistakable silence, a void filled with those who cannot move on because of what they've lost.
And that's the brutality of the disease, I think. It's terrifyingly lonely for both the people who are trying to help you and the people going through it.
Every day, hundreds of new families enter that same lonely world. 2 years and 1 million deaths later, Americans have not found the collective will to stop it from happening. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
A Canadian province hit hard in the early stages of the pandemic intends to lift its mask mandate next week. Quebec will be the last province in this country to do so. Its top doctor says the peak of the 6th wave has now passed and COVID-19 numbers are down. Though, as Dan Spector reports, many suspect the reason could also be political.
The shoppers inside this Montreal grocery store will soon look very different. Masks will no longer be mandatory in public indoor spaces in Quebec. It will be the last province to drop the mandate.
It's fun to know that finally we're going to turn the page.
Like other jurisdictions, Quebec will still require masks in certain settings like public transit and hospitals. Prince Edward Island removes its mandate Friday. It's the only other province still masking. Ontario and Alberta lifted requirements in March. Still, many in Montreal feel it's just too soon.
I'm still going to keep it for quite a while.
If the COVID is a risk, I'm going to keep it.
Quebec says with cases, hospitalizations, and deaths trending downward, the timing is backed up by data. But like in Ontario, Quebec voters head to the polls soon. Immunologist Dr. André Veillette thinks that is a major motivator. He would have waited longer.
You know, they do surveys and they see how the mood of the population is going. And I'm sure this kind of thing is not the only factor, but it's one of the factors.
Montreal Public Health has released new research about outbreaks in workplaces, finding during the first 3 pandemic waves that people who work in food processing, warehousing, and manufacturing were the hardest hit. Though hard lessons have been learned and vaccination is more widespread than ever, workers in those sectors remain vulnerable.
It's not because the masks are not mandatory that it's mandatory not to wear them.
And the more we don't wear masks,
many immunocompromised people are feeling anxious and left behind.
It's like they're taking away from drivers your airbag and your seatbelt. And so if I'm still wearing a mask, it's not enough.
People are of course free to continue wearing masks, with officials reminding Quebecers to respect the choices of their neighbors. Dan Spector, Global News, Montreal.
More rain is coming to southern Manitoba this weekend, but forecasters say it's unlikely to be enough to worsen the flood. These aerial views from the area near Steinbach show much of the region underwater. Up to 10 more millimeters of rain is on the way. Local states of emergency have been declared in 25 communities, and the Red River Valley is being closely monitored as this spring flooding season continues. Water levels aren't expected to return to normal until the end of the month. Squaring off coming up, the first debate between federal Conservative leadership hopefuls. Five of the 6 candidates vying for the federal Conservative leadership are facing off tonight for an unofficial leadership debate. It's the first time they're on the same stage presenting their visions for the future of the party. Abigail Beeman is tracking it tonight.
How much did you get from Huawei? Answer the question.
This is a company that was welcomed in Canada.
Lots of attacks, not much detail on policy.
That's not true. I was among the loudest voices.
That you were not one of the loudest voices, Mr. Poilievre.
Right. Leslyn Lewis targeted perceived frontrunner Pierre Poilievre.
In fact, I did it if I could. If I could If I could, in fact...
Poilievre refrained from firing back, perhaps because he doesn't want to alienate Lewis's social conservative supporters should there be a second ballot, and he aimed his fire at the other leading candidate, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest.
Your Liberal Party took $500,000 of illegal donations. When you were the head of that party, the average trucker has more integrity in his pinky finger than you had in your entire scandal-plagued Liberal cabinet.
And Charest, who has been out of the spotlight for some time, fired right back.
Mr. Poilievre, during that period, supported an illegal blockade. You cannot make laws and break laws and then say I will make laws for other people.
Ontario MPP Roman Baber largely focused on COVID.
No one on the stage stood up for Canadians until the truckers came to town.
He was kicked out of his provincial Conservative caucus for criticizing the Ford government.
We do not need lockdowns. It was the greatest catastrophe perpetuated on our generation.
While MP Scott Aitchison consistently aimed for the high road.
And here we are, calling each other names. What Canadian is going to trust this lot? We've got to do better.
Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown is not taking part. His campaign says he's too busy selling memberships. And overall, selling memberships seems to be going well. Sources tell Global News the party is on track to hit 500,000 members. That would be nearly double the count at the last leadership race in 2020.
Abigail, you watched the debate. Do you think it helped make clear the differences in their policies?
Well, Donna, over 90 minutes, there wasn't a whole lot on policy. It was clear most candidates feel opposing any COVID mandates and lockdowns are popular with voters, since even though there are few federal restrictions in place, candidates went back to that issue, criticizing restrictions. There was also a lot of media bashing. But what emerged most clearly was a better picture of the dynamics and who feels threatened by whom. Charest and Poilievre spent a lot of time attacking each other, and Lewis attacked Poilievre, although he did not fire back. The first of two official debates takes place next week in Edmonton with all 6 candidates on stage. Donna?
All right, Abigail Beeman, thank you. First the ball, then the batter ahead. More fortune for the luckiest Yankees fan. Rescuers in China have pulled a woman alive from the debris of a 6-story building 6 days after it collapsed. The woman, who was conscious, was rushed to the hospital, said to be in relatively good condition. She was trapped for about 132 hours. Search crews had used sniffer dogs and drones to find her. 26 people were killed when the rear of the building suddenly caved in on Friday. At least 9 people have been arrested, including the building's owner. 4 face charges over liability, suspected of ignoring building codes. A young baseball fan had another incredible moment last night to cap off an unforgettable week. 9-year-old Derek Rodriguez met his baseball idol, New York Yankees superstar Aaron Judge. He got the chance because of this beautiful moment when a Blue Jays fan caught one of Judge's home run balls and handed it right over to the boy. Rodriguez says he not only got to meet his hero, he also made a new best friend. Next, a bank settles with an Indigenous man and his granddaughter wrongly accused and arrested in Vancouver. An Indigenous man and his granddaughter, who were arrested and handcuffed by Vancouver police after a bank accused them of fraud, have now reached a settlement of their human rights complaint against the Bank of Montreal. Maxwell Johnson, an artist from the Heiltsuk Nation, was simply trying to add his granddaughter's account to his own. Bank employees not only refused, they called 911. Now, after 2.5 years, Johnson is reflecting on what he calls a long, hard journey.
Part of our culture is to forgive. We don't hold on to anything.
Maxwell Johnson never wanted to be the center of this story, yet today he came back to the same spot on a Vancouver street in front of a BMO bank, which wrongly accused him and his granddaughter of fraud. His human rights complaint against the bank finally settled.
I'm just glad to be able to stand up for myself and for my kids and grandkids and other people that are afraid to come forward to stand their ground.
It was here 2.5 years ago that he and his then 12-year-old granddaughter were arrested and handcuffed. All they'd tried to do was open a bank account using their Indigenous status cards as ID. The bank refused, suspected fraud, and called the police. There was no evidence of fraud, no charges were laid, and the bank has since apologized. In April, an independent review found the two officers acted without reasonable and probable grounds. They were suspended for several days.
It took a lot of trust away from my granddaughter, my son, and myself. It's been really hard. I suffer from a mental illness called panic disorder, and I had to overcome the fear of talking in public again.
Johnson lives here in the Great Bear Rainforest on BC's Central Coast. A member of the Heiltsuk First Nation, he's an artist and a cultural leader in his community. His work adorns the front of the big house. His financial settlement with BMO hasn't been disclosed, but for Johnson, this is about so much more than money.
Our people have been on the coast for over 14,000 years. That's longer than the pyramids have been up. So I just want people to educate themselves more about First Nations issues and our culture.
In the spirit of forgiveness, he's created this piece of art and gifted it to the bank.
On the bottom, it's got the BMO logo on there. It just shows that we're working together to get past this and be on good terms. It's good medicine.
The officers who made the arrests have been invited to an apology ceremony in Bella Bella. They have yet to accept. Johnson did one more thing today. He closed his bank account with BMO.
Well, if you went through something I did, you'd want to change banks too.
It is the end of a chapter, he says, but not of the healing. Late today, BMO put out a statement saying it's pleased a settlement has been reached and that it's an important step in reconciliation. That is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Today was Red Dress Day in Canada to remember the countless Indigenous women and girls lost to racism and violence. We leave you tonight with some of the gatherings across the country. According to the National Inquiry's final report in 2019, Indigenous women and girls were 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing in Canada than any other demographic. Thanks for watching. Jeff Semple will be at the anchor desk tomorrow, and I'll see you on Saturday for the new reality. Bye-bye.